Dr. Adrian Voss had been alone with the manuscript for 11 days before he read it aloud. This was not the plan. The plan, such as it had been approved by the Aldenmore Museum's Board of Acquisitions and ratified by 3 separate academic committees, was to photograph, digitize, and perform spectral analysis on the manuscript's 240 pages over a period of 6 weeks. Voss was to produce a preliminary report. He was not to touch the pages with unloved hands, was not to introduce any light source brighter than the specially calibrated examination lamps, and was absolutely not to remove the manuscript from its climate-controlled case between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., when the building's humidity regulations cycled down for maintenance. He had broken all 3 rules by the 4th day. The manuscript did that to people. He'd read enough of the literature to know this intellectually, had cited Friedman and Tiltman and a dozen others in his preliminary notes, with the detached authority of a man cataloging other people's obsessions. He understood now, on day 11, that those citations had been profoundly condescending. Friedman and Tiltman had not been obsessed. They had been correct. The manuscript was not a puzzle that rewarded patience. It was a puzzle that created it, manufactured it in the examining mind the way a fever manufactures heat, and once that process started it did not stop until you either solved it or gave up. And Adrian Voss had never given up on anything in 44 years of living. He had the solution at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October. It came the way solutions always came to him, not as a sudden arrival but as the slow surfacing of something that had been rising from the bottom of his mind for days, breaking the surface so quietly that for a moment, he wasn't sure it had broken at all. He sat very still at his examination table with the manuscript open before him and looked at the passage he'd been working on for 3 days and understood, with a particular certainty that required no verification, that he was reading it correctly. The language was not encoded. It had never been encoded. It was a constructed language, built from components of 4 separate medieval tongues, with a grammar that operated on rules he'd spent 11 days reverse engineering from context. And the reason no one had cracked it in 600 years was not that it was impenetrably complex. It was that every serious scholar had eventually arrived at the same threshold he was standing at now and had, for reasons they probably couldn't articulate, stopped. He understood that too, in the way you understand a thing in your body before your mind has finished processing it. There was something wrong with the passage, something in the grammar of it, in the specific construction of its sentences, that was not meant for reading silently. The grammar was imperative and oral, built for a voice, designed to be performed rather than studied. This was a script. This was meant to be spoken aloud. He looked at the passage for a long time. Then he began to read. His voice in the empty examination room sounded strange to him from the first syllable. Too loud, too present, the acoustics of the space doing something odd with the consonants of the constructed language. He read carefully, following the grammar he'd mapped, giving each word its proper weight and duration. The language had a rhythm to it that his mouth found naturally, as though the sounds had been calibrated for a human throat, and that naturalness should have worried him and didn't. He finished the passage. The room was quiet. He sat very still and listened to that quiet. It had a different quality than the quiet before he'd read, not the neutral silence of an empty building at midnight, but something with pressure behind it, the silence of a held breath. The examination lamps hummed, the climate system cycled, and beneath those familiar sounds something else had changed, some property of the room that he couldn't name but could feel on his skin, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives. Then, from somewhere below, from the ground floor, the maintenance level, the part of the building where the cleaning staff worked through the night, came a sound. Not one impact, a series of them, rhythmic and getting louder, like something very large orienting itself in a space too small for it, learning the dimensions of its new body. Adrian stood and went to the door and opened it. The corridor outside was empty, lit by the low overnight lighting that turned everything amber and flat. He stood in the doorway and listened and heard, from the direction of the stairwell at the far end of the corridor, a sound that stopped his breath. The ventilation grate at floor level beside the stairwell door was moving, not rattling, being pushed, steadily, with focused and inhuman patience, the screws backing out of the wall one by one as something on the other side applied pressure from below. He recognized the sounds coming from inside the shaft, the drag, the specific weight. Frank. He stepped back into the room and locked the door, and knew immediately that the door was not going to be enough. He was right. It took 11 minutes. He spent the first 4 at the examination table, gloves on, working through the next passage in the manuscript with the focused speed of a man who has run out of alternatives. The passage was shorter than the first. He mapped the grammar in 4 minutes and understood what it required and sat back and looked at the ceiling and felt the specific weight of what he was reading. A voice, given willingly, not taken, given. The speaker had to understand what they were surrendering and surrender it anyway, with full comprehension and consent. He sat with that for a long moment. He thought about what a voice meant to a man who had no other currency, no family, no history of warmth, no particular talent for being present in a room except through language. He had given lectures in 7 countries. He had argued before academic committees that had changed entire fields. He had, on 3 occasions in his life, said exactly the right thing to a person in pain, and those 3 occasions were among the few he returned to with anything resembling pride. All of that lived in his voice. All of it would go. He was still sitting with this when the ventilation grate on the eastern wall of the examination room came off entirely. It hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Adrian was on his feet before the echo died. The shaft opening was 18 inches square, set low in the wall behind the equipment rack, and from it came the smell first. Cold metal and something beneath it, something biological and wrong, like meat left in a cold place for too long. Then the sound, that low, continuous vibration, filling the room from the opening, resonating in the glass of the display cases, in the metal legs of the examination table. Then Frank came out of the wall. He came through the opening with a speed that had no business existing in a 67-year-old body. No hesitation, no acknowledgement of the tight space, the body simply not caring about the constraints that living bodies respect. He unfolded from the shaft and stood upright in the corner, and Adrian had 1 full second to look at him before everything started moving. Frank's face was Frank's face. That was the worst part. The eyes were open and they were not Frank's eyes. They had that total, depthless focus of something that had no use for recognition or memory or the 25 years of shared space that should have made this room familiar. But the face was the face Adrian had seen every night for 11 years. The jaw was wrong, hanging lower than it should, the mouth open in the constant vibration that was not a sound Frank had ever made in his life. His hands were open at his sides, the fingers spread, and he was already moving. Adrian threw the equipment rack between them. It bought him 2 seconds. Frank walked through it the way you walk through a curtain, the rack hitting the floor, the instruments on it scattering, and Adrian was at the examination table with his hand on the manuscript when Frank's hand closed on his shoulder. The grip was extraordinary, not the grip of a man, the grip of something that had learned how hands worked from the outside, that understood the mechanical function without the biological limitation. Adrian felt his shoulder compress in a way that shoulders were not designed to compress, and he shouted and twisted, and the manuscript came with him, and they both went to the floor. He hit the ground hard, shoulder first, the same shoulder, and the pain was immediate and bright and total. The manuscript landed beside him. He grabbed it and rolled and put the examination table between himself and what had been Frank. And what had been Frank picked up the table and moved it aside with one hand as though it were cardboard. Adrian backed against the far wall. He was breathing in short, hard pulls. His left shoulder was on fire. Frank was 8 feet away and closing, and Adrian looked at his face. Really looked, the way you look at something you are desperately searching for something inside of, and saw nothing. Nothing human, nothing remaining. Nothing that remembered the coffee cart, or the knock on the door, or any of the 1,000 small kindnesses that had gone unacknowledged. Then Frank stopped. He stood 4 feet from Adrian, and his face changed. The jaw closed. The vibration stopped. The eyes shifted, the depthless focus replaced by something that looked horribly, convincingly, like recognition, like distress, like a man surfacing from very deep water. Adrian, Frank's voice. Exactly Frank's voice, the slight rasp of a lifelong smoker, the accent unchanged. Adrian, what's happening to me? I can't. Something's wrong, I can't. Adrian looked at him. His shoulder was screaming. The manuscript was in his hands. He looked at Frank's face, doing Frank's expressions, Frank's voice coming from Frank's mouth, and he felt the pull of it, the enormous, exhausted pull of wanting it to be true. He looked at Frank's hands. They were still open, still spread, the same configuration as before, the same mechanical readiness. The voice and the face had changed, but the hands had not gotten the message, and that was the tell. The thing wearing Frank had learned faces and voices but hadn't thought about the hands. Adrian stepped to the side. Frank lunged. There was a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall 6 inches from Adrian's right hand. He noted it 11 days ago the same way he noted everything in a new workspace. Catalogued it, filed it, forgotten it until now. He pulled it from the bracket and swung it as Frank's momentum carried him past, connecting with the back of Frank's skull with a sound that he would hear in quiet moments for the rest of his life. Frank went down. He stayed down. His chest was moving, breathing, still alive, and his hands had finally relaxed, the fingers curled inward, and he looked, in that moment of stillness on the floor of the examination room, more like Frank than he had since he'd come out of the wall. Adrian stood over him and breathed. His shoulder felt broken. It probably wasn't. He looked at the manuscript in his other hand and then he heard it. From the ventilation shaft in the eastern wall, from somewhere inside the building's ductwork, a new set of sounds, movement, deliberate, patient, getting closer. A second set coming through the same route Frank had taken. He had no idea how far away they were. Minutes, maybe, less. He sat down on the floor beside the unconscious body of Frank DeLuca and opened the manuscript and began to read. The constructed language felt different in his mouth this time. The first passage had come naturally, had fit his throat without resistance. This one pushed back, required effort in the way that true things sometimes require effort, the way honesty costs more than performance. He read carefully, giving each word its weight, and his voice filled the examination room and he felt it going as he read, felt the subtraction of it, not like losing a limb but like a slow lowering of something that had always been at full volume, a dimmer switch turned by an invisible hand. From the shaft, the sounds got closer. He didn't look up. He read the final sentence. His voice on the last word was barely a sound, a breath with shape, then nothing. The building was silent. The sounds in the shaft stopped. He sat on the floor for a long time without moving. His shoulder pulsed with heat. The manuscript was open in his lap. Beside him Frank DeLuca was breathing, slowly, evenly, and the vibration that had filled the room was gone, replaced by the ordinary sounds of a building at rest. The climate system, the distant hum of the elevator, the small, unremarkable sounds of a world reasserting its correct inventory. He tried to speak, nothing. He tried again, nothing. He sat with that for a moment and found, to his mild surprise, that he was not devastated. He had known what he was paying and he had paid it, and Frank was breathing beside him, and the sounds in the shaft had stopped, and those 2 facts were enough for now. They would have to be enough. He got to his feet slowly, favoring the shoulder, and walked to the ventilation shaft and looked in. Empty, dark, ordinary metal ductwork going about its business. He went to the door and opened it. The corridor was empty. The amber lighting ran its length without interruption. At the far end, near the stairwell, Frank DeLuca's cleaning cart sat against the wall, the mop still in its bucket, undisturbed. Adrian looked at it for a moment, the ordinary, patient presence of it, a thing that belonged exactly where it was, and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tightened. He walked the length of the corridor slowly, passing the glass cases where smaller artifacts sat in their correct places, each familiar object settling something further in him. He walked down the stairs to the ground floor and found the building silent and exactly as it should be. The security station at the front entrance was occupied, a guard he didn't know by name sitting in his chair, eyes closed, breathing steadily. Adrian stood and looked at him for a long moment and moved on. He went back upstairs. He found Frank sitting up in the corner of the examination room, his back against the wall, his hand at the back of his head with an expression of profound confusion. When Adrian crouched in front of him, Frank looked at him with clear eyes, recognizing him, simply and completely, the full recognition of a man who knew who he was looking at, and that recognition hit Adrian somewhere in the chest with more force than the floor had. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Frank looked at him for a moment, reading his face with the attentiveness of a man who had spent 25 years paying attention to the people around him. He looked at the extinguisher on the floor, the overturned equipment rack, the scattered instruments. He looked at Adrian's shoulder, at the way Adrian was holding it. He reached out and put his hand on Adrian's arm, briefly, the way you touch someone when words would be the smaller gesture. They sat together on the floor of the examination room for a while, the two of them, in the particular silence of people who have been through something together without fully understanding what it was. Adrian Voss submitted his preliminary report to the Acquisitions Board 6 weeks later. It contained his complete linguistic analysis of the manuscript, the full grammatical framework of the constructed language, and a partial translation covering approximately 60% of the text. The remaining 40% he listed as requiring further study. He did not mention the 2 passages. He communicated the report's findings to the board via written memo, as he had begun doing with all of his professional communications. His colleagues noted the change with varying degrees of concern and attributed it, variously, to a throat condition, a personal crisis, or simple eccentricity, which, given Adrian's history, was the explanation most of them settled on. The manuscript was returned to its climate-controlled case. The case was locked. The examination room was reassigned. Whether what he had read aloud on that Tuesday night in October was fully reversed, or only partially, or not at all, whether the condition the second passage described as its mechanism was something he had genuinely met, or something that required a precision he couldn't verify. This was a question he returned to in the small hours of the morning with some regularity. He turned it over in silence, and examined it from different angles and arrived at no conclusion that satisfied him. Frank DeLuca brought him coffee every night at 9. Adrian nodded his thanks, as he always had, and returned to his work. Outside, the October wind moved through the city, and the building held its contents in the dark, and the manuscript sat in its case in its climate-controlled silence, and whatever was in it, if anything remained of what had been in it, waited with the patience of something that did not experience time.
If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like, comment, or share this video with your friends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this one.